Imagine moving into a new home, only to find out it used to be a funeral parlor. The walls still smell of embalming fluid, and the spirits of the dead never left. This is the true story of the Snedeker family, a haunting so disturbing that it shook paranormal investigators and inspired one of Hollywood's most chilling horror movies. But what really happened inside that house in Connecticut? Tonight, we uncover the terrifying truth. It was the kind of summer morning that makes small-town Vermont look like a postcard. Sunlight spilling through maple trees, the scent of dew, a gentle breeze rolling over the hills. But as Helen Parker stood outside the two-story colonial on Hollow Creek Road, something in her chest tightened. Maybe it was just nerves. Maybe it was the smell, faint, metallic, like old coins left in a damp drawer. The Parkers had driven nearly 200 miles from Albany to reach this town, Harrogate, a quiet stretch between Burlington and the Green Mountains. They weren't tourists. They were looking for a lifeline. For the past 6 months, the family had lived in hospitals and motels, while their 15-year-old son, Ethan, underwent radiation for Hodgkin's lymphoma. The treatment was working, but the cost was crushing. Medical bills stacked like bricks. Mark's trucking hours were cut in half, and Helen had started cleaning houses at night. They needed somewhere affordable near Ethan's hospital in Burlington. Somewhere stable, even if stable meant desperate compromise. When Helen first saw the "For Rent" sign outside the pale blue colonial, she thought it was a miracle. 2 floors, 6 rooms, an enclosed porch, and a small garden. Rent was less than half what they'd paid in Albany. There had to be a catch, but she wanted to believe in good luck again. Inside, sunlight pooled across dusty floorboards. The windows were old but clean, framed with white lace curtains. The air was cool, carrying a faint medicinal tang she couldn't place. The landlord, a stout man named Mr. Lawson, met them at the door with a forced smile. "It's an old place," he said, jingling keys. "Colonial build. Used to be an office, I think." He didn't elaborate, and Helen didn't ask. Ethan, pale and thin but trying to look brave, ran his fingers along the banister. "Can I take the basement room?" he asked. "It's cooler down there." Mark shrugged. "Sure, kid. Whatever makes you comfortable." The basement smelled of damp concrete and faint disinfectant. A narrow corridor ran the length of the foundation, with 2 doors branching off, one leading to a storage room, the other to a windowless chamber lined with gray tile. The family assumed it was a utility space. Helen noticed a metal hook embedded in the ceiling beam, but told herself it was for hanging tools. That night, as boxes filled the living room and laughter returned for the first time in months, Helen whispered a small prayer of thanks. They had a home. That had to mean something. It began with a voice. Around 2 a.m., Ethan woke to what he thought was his mother calling his name. He sat up, dizzy from medication, and listened. Nothing. Only the hum of the refrigerator upstairs. Then it came again. Lower, closer, masculine. "Ethan." He froze. The voice carried from the hallway outside his room. "Come downstairs. I've got something to show you." There was no further downstairs. He was already at the bottom. He stared toward the door, half expecting to see his father standing there. But the doorway was empty, the light from the hall a pale rectangle against the dark. He waited. The silence pressed like weight on his chest. When he finally found the courage to move, he ran up the stairs, 2 at a time, and burst into the kitchen. His mother was asleep on the couch, his father snoring in the recliner. The clock read 2:14 a.m. Ethan didn't mention it in the morning. He told himself it had been a dream, a side effect of painkillers or exhaustion. Within a week, Helen began noticing small changes. Picture frames turned slightly. The hallway light flickered even after she replaced the bulb. The house seemed to hum at night, like the faint vibration of machinery far away. Grace, her 10-year-old daughter, asked if she could sleep in her parents' room. "Why?" Helen asked, folding laundry. "There's a woman in my room," Grace whispered. "She stands by the dresser. She just looks at me." Helen brushed it off. "Nightmares, it's all this moving around." Narration. But later, as Helen tucked her daughter in, she noticed tiny handprints on the inside of the window pane, too small for Grace's own. Downstairs, Ethan grew more withdrawn. He stopped sketching the landscapes he used to love. Instead, his drawings became monochrome smears of shadows and faces without eyes. He started signing them Mr. Gray. Mark, still commuting to Albany for work, was rarely home. He dismissed the oddities as nerves and fatigue. "You've been through hell. Don't let the house mess with you," he'd say. But one evening, as Helen scrubbed the kitchen counter, her sponge smeared something sticky and dark across the surface. She turned on the light. It wasn't juice. It was red. Deep red. When she looked back, the streak had vanished. She told no one. On a Sunday afternoon, Helen met Arthur Bennett, a retired teacher and local historian at the Harrogate Library. She wanted to learn about their new neighborhood, maybe distract herself. When she mentioned their address, Bennett's eyes narrowed behind thick glasses. "Hollow Creek Road?" he said softly. "That old house. You're living in the Harper and Sons building." She frowned. "What was that?" "Funeral home," he replied. "Closed in '63 after an incident. Officially, a sanitation violation. Unofficially," he stopped himself. "You might not want to hear it." But Helen insisted. Bennett sighed. "Bodies were left too long. There were rumors the mortician was experimenting with new preservation methods. He disappeared before trial. House sat empty for years." Helen laughed it off, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. That night she told Mark. He chuckled, poured himself another beer, and said, "So what? It's just old pipes and bad wiring. Ghost stories sell newspapers." But deep down, even he had started to feel it. The way shadows clung too long to corners, the way the house seemed to listen. By late July, the basement felt colder than the rest of the house. The thermometer read 48 Baldig, even on warm nights. Ethan kept the door shut, but Helen often found it ajar in the morning. One evening, as she carried laundry down, she paused halfway. A faint melody drifted up, a music box tune, delicate and wrong, echoing from the dark below. She called Ethan's name. No reply. When she reached the bottom, the light switch didn't work. Her heart pounded as she edged forward, guided by the sound. Then she saw it, a small silver crucifix spinning slowly on the floor, as if someone had just dropped it. When she bent to pick it up, the music stopped. "He doesn't belong to you anymore." The voice was male, deep, right behind her ear. She turned. Nothing. Only the steady drip of water from a rusted pipe. Helen ran upstairs, dropping the laundry basket. It was the first time she admitted to herself that something was wrong. Days later, Ethan handed her a new sketch. "It's the man who talks to me," he said simply. The drawing showed a tall figure in a dark suit. Face blurred except for its mouth, stretched into an unnatural grin. Behind it were rows of what looked like boxes or coffins. Helen's stomach turned. "Honey, this isn't real. It's a dream." Ethan smiled faintly. He says, dreams are just doors. That night, Helen dreamt of the same man, standing by Ethan's bed, whispering something she couldn't hear. When she woke, the crucifix above her door had fallen to the floor, its chain snapped. Mark returned home the following weekend. The tension was thick. Helen tried to explain what had been happening, but he waved it off until the lights flickered and the kitchen radio burst into static. Then, through the static, a voice said, "Come downstairs." The line went dead. For the first time, Mark looked scared. He grabbed a flashlight and descended the basement steps. Helen waited at the top, gripping the banister. "Mark?" she called. A pause. Then his voice echoed up, shaky. "Hell, you need to see this." She joined him, stepping into the farthest room. Against the wall stood a long steel table. Not a workbench, not a dining table. On it lay a cracked porcelain tag etched with faint letters, Harper and Sons Mortuary. Next to it was a small drawer filled with thin metal plaques, nameplates blank and cold. Helen whispered, "We have to leave." Mark shook his head. "We can't afford to, and we're not letting some story scare us out of a roof over our heads." But from that night on, even he slept with the lights on. 2 nights later, thunder rolled over Harrogate. Rain lashed the windows, wind howled through the eaves. Ethan woke to the smell of earth and rot. In the mirror opposite his bed, something moved, a faint reflection that wasn't his, a face colorless and smooth, watching him. He threw the blanket over his head, trembling until dawn. When Helen came down in the morning, she found the word home scrawled into the dust on the mirror's surface. She tried to wipe it away, but the letters remained etched into the glass. By August, the Parkers no longer joked about their new house. Every sound felt like a signal, every shadow a watcher. And though they still clung to the logic of ordinary life, bills, chores, hospital visits, somewhere deep inside, they knew. Something in that house had been waiting. And now it wasn't waiting anymore. By late August, the Parkers' new life in Harrogate no longer felt like a blessing. The laughter that had once filled the living room was replaced by a careful quiet, the kind of silence people use when they're afraid of being overheard. Every morning the house seemed a little colder. Helen would wake before dawn, listening to the hum in the walls. It wasn't the furnace was off. It was something deeper, like a low breath echoing through the pipes. Ethan had grown thinner. His color improved according to the doctors, but his eyes looked darker, as if he hadn't slept in weeks. He spent hours sketching in the sunroom, his pencils scraping furiously across paper. When Helen peeked one afternoon, she froze. The drawings weren't of faces anymore. They were corridors. Endless corridors leading to a black door marked with a single word, below. That night, when she went to switch off the lamp beside his bed, Ethan whispered without opening his eyes, "He says the light hurts his eyes." Helen didn't ask who he was. Grace had started hearing footsteps in the hallway outside her room. At first, she thought it was Ethan sleepwalking. Then she heard a woman humming. The tune was unfamiliar, old-fashioned, broken by faint sobs. One morning she ran into the kitchen, pale and shaking. "Mom, the woman in the black dress came again," she said. She was crying this time. She said, "He's still down there." Helen crouched to meet her daughter's eyes. "Sweetheart, there's nobody here but us. You're dreaming." Grace shook her head. "Then why did she touch my hair?" The little girl lifted a strand of blonde hair. It was wet, as if someone had brushed damp fingers through it. Helen wanted to believe it was sleep paralysis, stress, anything rational. But when she went to Grace's room, the smell hit her first. Lilacs and something metallic underneath. like funeral flowers left too long in a vase. When Mark came home the following weekend, Helen finally told him everything, the whispers, the smell, the drawings, the woman. He listened, jaw tight, beer untouched. "I don't know what's happening," she said. "But it's not just stress, Mark. The kids—" He interrupted. "Hell, I've been hauling freight all week. I'm dead tired, and you're telling me ghosts are messing with the water pipes." But that night, around 3 a.m., Mark heard it too. Music, an old tune drifting up through the vents. It sounded like a church organ playing underwater. He followed the sound to the basement door. The moment he opened it, silence. He stared down the steps, flashlight trembling slightly. The beam caught something on the concrete. Shoe prints, wet and leading away from Ethan's room. Only they were backward, the toes pointing up the stairs. Mark didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, a knock came at the door. Helen opened it to find Diane Cooper, a woman in her 60s with cropped silver hair and a nervous smile. She lived 2 houses down and brought a pie wrapped in foil. "I heard you folks moved into the Hollow Creek house," she said. "I used to work there, long time ago." Helen hesitated. "At the funeral home?" Diane nodded. "Back when it was Harper and Sons. I was just a secretary, kept the books. I left before it closed." "Thank God." Her eyes darted toward the basement door behind Helen. "You found the tiles down there, didn't you? How did you—" "They built those rooms so the walls could be washed down fast. You didn't hear this from me, but Mr. Harper had strange habits. Nights when no bodies were scheduled, he'd keep the lights burning anyway. Said he was perfecting the passage ritual. None of us wanted to ask what that meant." Before leaving, Diane placed a small wooden cross in Helen's palm. "Keep it near the stairs," she whispered. "He doesn't like that spot." That evening, Helen cooked dinner while the kids watched TV. Mark sat at the table sorting through bills. The house was unusually quiet. Then a pot slid off the stove by itself, clattering across the floor. Everyone jumped. Mark swore, picking it up. "Loose handle," he muttered. But Helen's eyes were fixed on the wall above the stove. A single handprint, dark, wet, and unmistakably human, was pressed into the wallpaper. It dripped once, then faded before their eyes. No one spoke for a long time. That was the first night the Parkers truly felt the house watching them. 2 nights later, Helen found Ethan sitting on the porch in his pajamas, eyes fixed on the dark woods beyond the yard. The porch light made his face look waxy and distant. She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. "You shouldn't be out here, honey. It's cold." He didn't look at her. "He likes it when it's cold," Ethan said quietly. "Who does?" "The man in the basement. He says the cold keeps him clear." Helen's stomach tightened. "Ethan, that's not funny." "I'm not joking." His voice dropped to a whisper. "His name is Mr. Gray. He says he worked here before we did. He said he can show me what comes after." Helen wanted to tell him it was all in his head, that sickness and medication could play tricks on the mind. But when she glanced at his hands, she froze. His fingernails were gray, stained with something like ash. That night, Helen took the blanket he'd used and locked it in the hall closet. By morning, it reeked of formaldehyde. Autumn crept across Vermont, staining the hills in gold and rust, but inside Hollow Creek Road, the air grew heavy and stale. Helen kept windows open, burned candles, scrubbed the floors twice a week. Yet the odor of rot always returned by evening. Mark's temper shortened. He blamed the smell on plumbing, blamed Ethan's drawings on teenage rebellion, blamed everything on exhaustion. "We're not haunted, Hell. We're broke," he'd snap, slamming another beer. But every argument seemed to stir the house. Plates rattled in cupboards, doors eased open on their own. Once, during a particularly vicious fight, the hallway light shattered above them, showering glass like rain. It was as if the house understood their words and chose sides. Helen began documenting what happened. At first, she used a notebook, then switched to a small cassette recorder she'd borrowed from work. Her entries were calm, clinical, until the night she played one back. Tape begins with ambient noise, faint static, Helen's voice. Basement, October 14th, 11:23 p.m. Temperature 47 degrees. Male voice, low, distant. "He's almost ready." She replayed it 3 times before calling Mark to listen. He stared at the recorder, pale, then threw it against the wall. "I don't want that thing in my house," he barked, but Helen had already copied the tape. She hid it inside her Bible. Grace had stopped sleeping through the night. Helen would find her curled up at the top of the stairs, clutching her stuffed rabbit. When asked why, the little girl whispered, "They talk down there." Helen knelt. "Who talks?" "The people who don't have faces." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "They said Ethan belongs to them now." Helen wanted to tell her daughter that ghosts weren't real, that everything would be fine, but even she no longer believed it. One Saturday, Helen gathered the courage to explore the basement again. She brought a flashlight, Diane's wooden cross, and a bucket of bleach water. Dust hung thick as smoke. She noticed something she hadn't before, a small door behind an old shelving unit. It was bolted shut. When she pried it open, the beam of her flashlight hit glass. Dozens of rectangular mirrors lined the hidden room from floor to ceiling. Some cracked, some pristine, all facing inward like an audience frozen mid-applause. As Helen stepped inside, her reflection multiplied into endless versions of herself. For a moment, every mirror showed her face. Then one didn't. In the far corner, her reflection turned away. The flashlight flickered. When it steadied again, the mirrors were empty. Helen ran upstairs, her breathing ragged. The next day, she found the little cross she had carried, the one Diane gave her, split neatly in half. By late October, the house at 42 Hollow Creek Road no longer felt like a home. It had become a maze of whispers, half-seen figures, and sleepless nights. Every corner seemed to echo with unseen movement, and every silence carried weight, as if something was listening, waiting. Mark Parker was unraveling. He no longer joked at the dinner table or read bedtime stories to Grace. When he came home from work, he'd sit in the truck long after the engine died, staring at the house through the windshield. Helen watched him from the kitchen window. The man who once carried her through storms now looked like someone being watched himself. He'd begun muttering in his sleep, fragments of conversations that made no sense. "It's not done yet. Keep the lights on," below the floorboards. When Helen tried to wake him, he'd jolt upright, drenched in sweat, insisting he hadn't said a word. Ethan grew quieter, too. His once vibrant sketches had become pale and frantic. He drew the basement door over and over, each version darker than the last, until the paper seemed to absorb the graphite. When Helen asked what it meant, he simply said, "That's not a door anymore, it's an eye." Desperate for answers, Helen visited the Harrogate Historical Society, a small brick building near the town library. She met Professor Lowell, an elderly historian with nicotine-stained fingers and eyes that carried too many late nights. When she mentioned the address, his expression tightened. "Ah, the Harper property," he murmured. People like to forget it, but there were stories. He pulled out a faded file, yellowed photographs, property deeds, and newspaper clippings. One headline read, "Local mortician under investigation for unlicensed experiments." Lowell explained that Franklin Harper, the original owner, had been accused of performing ritual preservation techniques, mixing spiritualism with early embalming practices. Witnesses described strange lights in the basement and late-night chanting. Harper died before trial, and the business was quietly shut down. Lowell closed the file and gave her a grave look. "Sometimes places remember things, Mrs. Parker, especially when the people who lived there wanted to be remembered." Helen went to see Diane Cooper again, clutching the file like a lifeline. The older woman listened without interrupting. When Helen finished, Diane sighed and said, "I tried to tell you. Some houses don't forget." Diane led her to the backyard, where autumn leaves piled like rust. She pointed to the ground behind the tool shed. "There used to be a well there. Harper said it was for drainage. But my brother found bones when they filled it. Animal bones, we thought. But the sheriff never confirmed." The air turned colder. Helen's breath fogged in front of her face. Diane placed a hand on her arm. "If the house wants your son, don't talk to it. Don't argue. It feeds on attention. Keep your family close." And the lights burning after sunset. That evening, Helen did exactly that. Every lamp, every bulb glowed through the house like a fragile barrier against the dark. But around midnight, a deep hum began to roll through the floorboards. Steady, rhythmic, like a pulse. Then, one by one, the lights went out. The house plunged into darkness. Helen's heart hammered. She reached for Mark's hand, but he was already moving towards the basement door. "Don't," she whispered. "Wait until morning." He shook his head. "It's just the breaker." The door creaked open, releasing a cold draft that smelled of dust and salt water. Mark's flashlight beam disappeared down the steps. For a moment, everything was still, until the sound came. A voice, faint and distant, echoing up from below. "Mark, you shouldn't have come." The flashlight hit the floor with a clang. Then silence. That was the night Helen Parker realized the house didn't want them gone. It wanted them broken. By November, Hollow Creek Road had turned from an address into an obsession. What began as whispers and cold drafts had become a force that shaped every breath, every argument, every decision the Parkers made. It was no longer about whether something was there, but what it wanted. Helen found the number scrawled on the back of an old magazine article. Northeast Paranormal Research Group, since 1972. She didn't believe in psychics or mediums, but she believed in fear, and fear had made her desperate. When the two investigators arrived, they looked more like teachers than ghost hunters. Dr. Aaron Cole, a soft-spoken psychologist from Boston, and Mira Jensen, a historian who'd spent years studying haunted properties across New England. They unpacked recorders, temperature meters, cameras. Their calm professionalism made Helen feel both relieved and embarrassed. Mira began by walking through the house slowly, murmuring observations. Temperature drop near the stairwell. Residual energy signature near the mirrors. This wall's been repainted. Something's sealed behind it. Aaron interviewed each family member separately. His questions weren't about ghosts. They were about memory, about loss, about the moment each person first felt the house turn against them. When Helen asked if he thought they were crazy, Aaron said quietly, "No, Mrs. Parker. You're living in a pressure cooker of grief, guilt, and suggestion. Sometimes that's enough to make a place breathe. The investigators stayed overnight, setting up motion cameras and thermal sensors. Helen couldn't sleep. She sat in the living room beside Mira, watching the monitor feed. At 2:14 a.m., the temperature dropped 8 degrees in under 10 seconds. The motion detector in the basement triggered. A soft light flared across the camera. Not white, but blue, shaped like smoke curling in a slow spiral. Mira whispered, "That's not electrical interference." Then came the audio, a low hum, like someone whispering beneath water. It grew louder until words began to form. "He's mine." The room plunged into static. When the feed returned, the basement was empty, except for a single open handprint, smeared across the camera lens. Aaron ended the session immediately. "We're leaving the basement sealed," he said. "No one goes down there until we understand what's happening." But by dawn, the basement door was open again. The next morning, Mira returned with old town records she'd requested from the Harrogate archives. She laid them out on the kitchen table. Photographs of the Harper family, architectural plans, and one chilling entry, a list of names under a column labeled unclaimed. Mira tapped the list with her pen. "These are the bodies Franklin Harper worked on. People without relatives, no records of burial. There are 19 names here and no cemetery entries for any of them." Helen felt cold. "You think they're still here?" Mira didn't answer directly. "Some hauntings," she said softly, "aren't about ghosts. They're about the forgotten asking to be remembered." Aaron believed the house was amplifying trauma, feeding on grief. Ethan's illness, your father's death, Mark's drinking, all of it creates a cycle of emotional energy. The house mirrors it back. It's not supernatural in the Hollywood sense. It's psychological architecture. The walls are remembering you. Helen wanted to believe that. She wanted it to be science, not spirits. But then she noticed something behind Aaron's chair, a faint shimmer in the corner, like heat rising from asphalt. It moved. "Aaron," she whispered. He turned, but there was nothing there, only the faint smell of smoke and lilacs. That night, the investigators packed up most of their equipment, leaving only motion sensors active. They planned to return in a week, but Helen couldn't stay away from the basement. She dreamed of it. The mirrors, the smell, the whisper of Mr. Gray. At 3:07 a.m., she found herself standing at the top of the stairs without remembering how she'd gotten there. The door was open and a faint blue glow pulsed below. Then came a familiar voice, gentle, comforting. "Helen, it's all right now. Come see what we built." She froze. It was Mark's voice. "Mark?" she called softly. No answer, only the hum. When she finally forced herself to shut the door, she heard a whisper against her ear, close enough to feel its breath. "You can't close what's already open." When the investigators returned 3 days later, the Parkers were gone. The lights were still burning. The mirrors were gone from the basement walls. Every one of them shattered. When news travels through a small New England town, it changes shape with every porch it crosses. By early winter, the whispers about the Parkers' house had become the town's favorite ghost story. But for Helen Parker, it wasn't a story. It was a wound that refused to close. After the investigators left, Helen moved the children into a small rental outside Burlington, while Mark stayed behind to wrap things up. He told her he needed time, that someone had to face the house. Within weeks, rumors spread. People claimed to see lights pulsing behind the drawn curtains at 42 Hollow Creek Road. A postal worker swore he heard organ music drifting from the basement. Teenagers dared each other to take photos on the porch at midnight. The local paper ran a column titled "Funeral Home Phantoms." It treated the haunting like folklore, a strange little piece of Vermont trivia. To the Parkers, it felt like mockery. When a haunting becomes public, the people inside it stop being neighbors. They become exhibits. Helen called every night. Sometimes Mark answered, sometimes he didn't. When he did, his voice sounded hollow, delayed, like a bad radio connection. "It's quiet here now," he said once. "Are you sleeping there alone?" "I don't think anyone really sleeps here, Hel." The calls grew shorter. Then they stopped. When Helen drove back to Harrogate to check on him, she found the truck in the driveway, engine cold, driver's door ajar. Inside the house, everything was exactly where she'd left it, except for one thing. On the kitchen table sat a cassette recorder. She pressed play, static, then a faint, rhythmic knocking. After a moment, Mark's voice. "If anyone hears this, tell them I understand now. It was never the house." Then silence. Helen called Dr. Aaron Cole. Within 24 hours, he and Mira Jensen were back in Vermont. They found Helen standing in the yard, staring at the house like someone studying a wild animal. Aaron asked gently, "Why come back?" Helen answered, "Because if I don't understand it, it wins." Inside, the air was still, almost polite. Dust covered the floors, but the smell, that strange mix of lilac and metal, lingered. In the living room, every photo of the Parker family had been turned face down. Mira moved through the rooms with her thermal scanner. She paused near the hallway mirror, one of the few unbroken ones left. "This house isn't dead," she said. "It's replaying itself." Aaron nodded. He believed trauma could leave residual energy, echoes repeating like a scratched record. If the Parkers' grief had soaked into the walls, the house might be caught looping its worst moments. They set up cameras again, this time focusing on the living room and basement door. At 9 p.m., the front door opened on its own. Cold air poured in, though there was no wind outside. On one monitor, Mark Parker walked through the frame, or something that looked like him. His face was pale, eyes unfocused. He turned toward the camera and whispered, "Tell her to stop looking for me." Then the feed cut to static. That recording would become the center of the Harrogate case file, number 412, now stored in the Vermont Historical Archive. To this day, no one has explained where the man in that footage came from, or why his shadow didn't move when he did. Once a haunting escapes its walls, it stops belonging to the people who lived it. It becomes public property, a headline, a podcast, a campfire story. That was what happened to the Parkers. 2 weeks after the investigators released their preliminary findings, the Burlington Chronicle ran an article. "The Parker Haunting, Fact, Folklore, or Fear." Reporters descended on Hollow Creek Road. They interviewed neighbors, former co-workers, even Grace's teachers. To Helen's horror, one station aired a segment replaying the distorted audio from Mark's final tape. Online forums dissected every syllable, debating whether it was evidence of a ghost or a man losing his mind. Helen refused to participate in interviews, but the attention made staying silent impossible. Every grocery run, every walk with Grace turned into questions from strangers. Did you really see him? What did the voice sound like? Are you still cursed? When grief becomes spectacle, the world forgets its grief. Aaron Cole, back at Boston University, presented the case at a private seminar titled "Environmental Triggers of Group Hallucination." He argued that shared trauma could manifest physically: temperature drops, auditory illusions, psychosomatic sensations. He never used the word ghost, but the recordings unsettled him. Late at night, he replayed the footage frame by frame. In one segment, captured at exactly 3:07 a.m., a figure appeared for less than a second, standing beside the basement door, one hand resting gently on the handle. It wasn't Mark. And when Aaron enhanced the still image, the face was a blur of motion, as though the person were shaking their head no. While academics debated and tabloids sold copies, Helen began her own investigation. She combed through town archives, property deeds, and hospital records. In an old obituary from 1946, she found it: Thomas Gray Harper, Franklin Harper's assistant. He died in the house after an accident involving chemical exposure. Official cause: asphyxiation due to formaldehyde inhalation. Local rumors suggested he'd been experimenting with ways to preserve the soul alongside the body. Helen drove to the cemetery listed on the death certificate, but there was no record of his burial. The caretaker, an elderly man with cloudy eyes, remembered the name. "They brought him here," he said, pointing toward a small grove near the fence. "But they never buried him. The coffin was empty." Back in the rental home, Grace handed her mother a drawing one morning, a picture of the old house. In the window stood a man with pale skin and dark eyes. He wasn't frightening, just watching. Above him, Grace had written in uneven letters, "He wants to come back." Helen's breath caught. "Where did you see him, sweetheart?" Grace shrugged. "In the dream. He said he's waiting for you." It's one thing to be haunted by a memory. It's another when the memory starts speaking through your child. One evening, Helen received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph: the house on Hollow Creek Road, taken at dusk. Every window was dark except one: the basement. Scrawled on the back in familiar handwriting were 3 words: "Come home, Helen." That photograph would become the final spark. Helen Parker, the woman who swore she'd never step foot in that house again, began packing her bags. Because some stories don't end when you escape them. They end when you turn around and face what's calling your name. Winter pressed hard on Vermont that year. The roads glittered with black ice, the sky a washed-out gray that never fully brightened. That was the color of the world the morning Helen Parker went back to Hollow Creek Road. She didn't tell anyone except Mira Jensen. Helen needed a witness, someone who wouldn't dismiss what she saw as hysteria or grief. Mira agreed on one condition: they would leave before midnight. The house looked smaller than Helen remembered, like something ashamed of itself. Frost had crept up the windows. The door hung crooked in its frame. Inside, the air smelled of dust and rainwater. Everything was exactly as she'd left it months ago, except for a new line of footprints leading from the kitchen to the basement door. Helen paused. "We never told anyone where the key was," she whispered. Mira switched on a small body cam. "Then let's document everything." They moved through the rooms methodically: dining room, bedrooms, hall. Every mirror that once hung on the walls now lay face down on the floor, glass intact but warped with moisture. In one of the upstairs rooms, Helen found the photograph that had been mailed to her, taped to the window pane from the inside. It was as if the house had been waiting for her to arrive so it could finish telling its story. Downstairs, Mira unpacked the same cassette recorder that had captured the mysterious voices months before. She set it on the counter and pressed record. The machine whirred softly, its single red light blinking. For 10 minutes, there was nothing, just the tick of the kitchen clock. Then, without anyone touching it, the recorder switched itself to play. Static, a man's voice, faint. "Mrs. Parker, you found him." Helen's hand shook. "That's Mark's voice." Mira frowned. "It can't be. This is a fresh tape." The voice returned, clearer this time. "Finish what he started." The machine stopped. The red light died. Mira insisted they check the basement before leaving. "If the source is environmental, wiring, pipes, vents, we need evidence," she said, though her voice betrayed doubt. They descended slowly. The air grew colder with each step, as though they were walking underwater. At the bottom, the flashlight beams caught a patch of disturbed concrete near the old embalming table. The cement was cracked, flaking like thin ice. Mira knelt and brushed away the dust. Beneath the concrete lay wood, rotted boards, the edge of what looked like a sealed trapdoor. She looked up at Helen. "You said the historian mentioned unclaimed bodies." Helen nodded, her throat tight. With a crowbar from the tool shelf, they pried open the boards. The smell that rose up wasn't decay, but formaldehyde and earth. Inside the small cavity lay dozens of glass jars, each containing a tag with a name written in faded ink. And in the center, a single metal plate engraved, "Thomas Gray, Preserver of Souls." Mira whispered, "He wasn't buried. He buried them here." The temperature plunged. Their breath turned to mist. From the walls came a faint vibration, like strings tightening on an unseen instrument. Helen gripped the table to steady herself. "Mira, do you feel that?" A whisper rose through the room, not a word but a long exhale that seemed to come from the cracked floor. The bulbs overhead flickered once, twice, then burned steady blue. Mira whispered, "We need to leave. Right now." Helen stared at the engraved plate. "If he's trapped here, maybe we can end it." She took the plate in both hands. The air pressure shifted. Pictures upstairs fell from their hooks with muffled thuds. But then the vibration stopped. Silence. Sometimes silence is the loudest sound a haunted place can make. They left before midnight. Helen locked the door and placed the metal plate in the back seat beside her. No voices followed them. No flickering lights trailed behind. For the first time in months, the night outside felt like ordinary darkness. As they drove away, Mira looked back through the rear window. The house stood motionless under the snow. One light burned faintly in the basement, steady, not flickering, like a lantern marking the end of a long vigil. In later interviews, both women would describe that night as the moment the haunting stopped behaving like a ghost story and started behaving like history. When a haunting ends, it doesn't vanish. It lingers in the quiet moments, in the smell of dust that seems too familiar, in the silence that feels slightly alive. For Helen Parker, the quiet after Hollow Creek was not peace, it was echo. 3 days after their return, Mira delivered the metal plate to the Harrogate Historical Society. It was catalogued as Artifact RH 219, accompanied by Mira's typed report, recovered from subfloor section of former Harper property, believed to mark the site of unregistered burials. No trace of human remains confirmed. Officials treated it as an interesting piece of local history, not evidence of a haunting. Still, word spread that the basement had been sealed with fresh concrete and the house placed under permanent town inspection. Harrogate finally slept again, but it slept uneasily. Helen and Grace settled in a small rented apartment above a bookstore in Burlington. Grace started at a new school and stopped drawing the house. Sometimes when she missed her father, she'd press a crayon to paper and draw a window with light inside it. Nothing else, just light. Helen took a part-time job at a clinic and began writing her own account of what had happened. She refused to call it a ghost story. In the preface, she wrote, "This is not about fear. It's about what grief does when it isn't heard." The book never found a publisher, but it became something else. A ritual of control, a way to give structure to chaos. Dr. Aaron Cole retired from teaching 2 years later. In his final lecture, he presented slides from the Harrogate case, noting how psychological trauma can reshape environmental perception. He never used the Parkers' names, but students recognized the story. Mira stayed in Vermont and became the curator of the Historical Society. Every October, visitors ask her to see the plate. She keeps it in a locked cabinet, and when she opens it, she always pauses first, as if listening. So far, the cabinet has remained quiet. On a rainy evening in spring, Helen found an envelope in her mailbox. No stamp, no return address, just her name in neat block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing one sentence typed on an old machine. "You were right to bring it into the light." There was no signature, but the paper smelled faintly of formaldehyde and lilacs. She didn't frame the note or burn it. She folded it and placed it between the pages of her unfinished manuscript, as if to let the story have the last word. A year later, a young couple bought the Hollow Creek house. They renovated the kitchen, repainted the walls, and turned the basement into a studio. When the local paper interviewed them, they smiled and said they'd heard rumors but had never seen anything strange. Yet neighbors occasionally noticed that the basement window glowed faintly blue on foggy nights. Most assumed it was a reflection from a television set. Perhaps it was. Or perhaps some stories don't end. They merely change address. Time softens even the sharpest memories, but it doesn't erase them. For the people of Harrogate, the story of Hollow Creek Road became less about ghosts and more about survival, about how a family faced something unexplainable and found their way back to the light. 5 years after the events at Hollow Creek, a film production company from New York visited the town. They had purchased the rights to a documentary script inspired by the Harrogate haunting. Locals called it The House That Knows Your Name. Mira Jensen served as historical consultant. She insisted the film avoid sensationalism. No cheap scares, no monsters, just a story about people and grief. When the movie premiered at a small theater in Burlington, Helen attended quietly, sitting in the back row. On screen, she watched a version of her family portrayed by actors. Their laughter, their fear, their strength. And for the first time, the house didn't look cruel to her. It looked sad, like something that had been trying all along to be understood. When the credits rolled, Helen stayed seated, tears glinting in the dark, not of fear, but of release. Grace Parker was 17 when she spoke publicly about the haunting for the first time, not to a reporter, but at a local art show. Her collection was titled Rooms of Light. Each painting showed an ordinary interior, a hallway, a bedroom, a kitchen, but somewhere in each one, a small, soft glow, a lamp, a candle, a reflection in glass. When asked what it meant, she said, "Every house remembers what it's seen. It's our job to fill it with something better." Critics praised her work for its warmth and emotional intelligence. Grace never painted ghosts, only places, because as she told one interviewer, "I don't believe in haunted houses. I believe in haunted hearts." Dr. Aaron Cole, retired but still curious, published a final paper titled Emotional Topography: The Architecture of Memory in Domestic Space. He cited the Harrogate case as an example of how environment can absorb and replay human emotion, a kind of psychological echo. He ended his paper with a single, uncharacteristically poetic line: "Perhaps some walls whisper not to frighten us, but to remind us that we once mattered here." The paper became widely quoted in both psychology and folklore studies. Students at Boston University still refer to the theory as Cole's resonance. Mira Jensen continued to work at the Historical Society until her retirement. Every October, she led walking tours of Harrogate's oldest buildings, finishing at the gate of Hollow Creek Road. The house, now privately owned, stood silent and well-kept. She would pause at the end of each tour and say, "This story isn't about ghosts. It's about listening, really listening, to what places are trying to tell us." She never charged admission, and every Halloween she left a small bouquet of lilacs at the base of the old fence. Helen spent her later years near Lake Champlain, teaching creative writing at a community college. She never remarried, but she kept a small circle of friends and a quiet joy about her. Her students said she had a gift for making even ordinary moments sound sacred. The way sunlight hit a kitchen floor, or how a child's laughter could fill an empty house. Sometimes she would mention Hollow Creek, not as a haunting, but as the place where I learned that light doesn't give up. She told her students that every story, no matter how dark, had a door in it, and beyond that door was choice. Maybe that was the real ending of the Harrogate haunting, not in an exorcism or revelation, but in the quiet decision to keep living. On a cool spring morning nearly 20 years later, Helen drove past Hollow Creek Road for the last time. The house had been painted a soft yellow. Children's bicycles leaned against the porch railing. She slowed the car, smiling faintly. In one of the upstairs windows, she thought she saw a flicker of light. Not blue, not cold, but golden, warm, alive. It reminded her of Grace's paintings, of rooms that chose to remember joy instead of fear. And for the first time, she didn't feel the house watching her. She felt it resting. Some stories refuse to stay buried. They live on, not as curses, but as questions. What happens to the places we leave behind? And what happens to the pieces of us that stay there long after we've gone? There's a photograph in the Burlington Museum's small exhibit on Haunted America. It shows the Hollow Creek house taken from the road on an overcast morning. No shadows, no faces in the windows. Just a modest two-story home with a pale yellow facade and a white fence. Most visitors glance past it quickly, drawn to the flashier legends. The Amityville house, the Winchester Mystery Mansion. But if you stand long enough in front of that photo, you'll notice something subtle. The reflection of a woman holding a camera, smiling faintly at her own reflection in the glass. That woman was Helen Parker. She donated the photograph herself, with a handwritten note attached. "We give places meaning. We can give them peace, too." 2 years after Helen's death, Grace discovered her mother's unfinished manuscript in a cedar trunk. The pages were yellowed but carefully kept. She read every word, the terror, the confusion, the love, and realized it wasn't just a story about a haunted house. It was a diary of survival. Grace edited and self-published the book, retitled The Light at Hollow Creek. It became a modest success, not for its horror, but for its honesty. Readers called it a haunting without hate, a story that turned pain into compassion. For every person who had ever lived through something they couldn't explain, Helen's words were a reminder. You can't control what visits you, but you can decide how to remember it. In her 90s now, Mira Jensen gave one last autumn tour of Harrogate's historic homes. Her voice trembled slightly, but her humor remained. When they reached Hollow Creek Road, she paused by the gate, the way she always had. "People used to ask me if I believe in ghosts," she said, smiling at the group gathered in the crisp air. "I don't know, but I believe in memory, and I believe memory is louder than any haunting." She placed her usual lilac bouquet by the fence, but this time she added something else. A folded piece of paper with a single line written in neat, deliberate ink. The past only lingers when it has something left to teach. The wind picked up, carrying her words through the trees. Years later, Grace became a lecturer in art therapy. Her students studied how light, space, and emotion intertwine. She used her own story not to frighten them, but to show them how creativity could turn fear into healing. She kept one painting from her early work, a small piece titled Basement Window. It hung in her studio, the faintest glow at its center. Every so often she'd catch herself staring at it, thinking she saw movement in the light. Not shadows, just something alive. A presence, gentle and familiar. Maybe it was imagination. Or maybe somewhere beyond what she could name. The house remembered her too. In the end, the Harrogate story wasn't about ghosts or demons. It was about what happens when love meets fear, when the past demands to be heard, and when someone finally listens. The echoes of the house became a kind of music, faint but steady, reminding anyone who heard it that even darkness carries lessons if you stay long enough to find them. What remains are not the footsteps in the hall or the flickering lights, but the people who refuse to let fear write their final chapter. Maybe every haunted house is just a memory waiting for closure. Maybe what we call ghosts are the emotions we left behind. Grief, guilt, love that never found a place to rest. But the Parkers taught us something simple and profound. You can rebuild your life on the same ground that once terrified you, because even after everything, light remembers its way home. Some say the house on Hollow Creek is quiet now. The paint is fresh. The garden's green again, and at night, it looks like any other home. But if you stand at the edge of the property when the air is still, you might hear it. Not the sound of footsteps, not whispers, just a soft exhale, as if the house itself is remembering to breathe. Maybe that's all hauntings really are, memories that refuse to die quietly. Maybe every ghost story is just grief, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. And maybe light doesn't destroy the dark, it teaches it how to be seen. Wherever Helen's story ends and wherever yours begins, remember this: the things that once frightened you can become the things that set you free. And if one night you pass a house glowing faintly on a foggy road, don't be afraid to look. Some homes don't want to scare you. They just want to be remembered.